Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Amy. And then I'll turn it over to Oktay Urcan, who's going to talk to us about the CRA Act and social externalities resulting from that. So the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ellison. This one?
So this goes forward, and this goes back.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to start by thanking conference organizers for including our paper here. It's our great pleasure and honor to be here. We are looking forward to your feedback as well as the discussion of Ellison and Luann. So in this paper, in terms of motivation, banks' performance, in terms of equitable treatment of customers is an important policy concern. To this end, bank regulators support their enforcement activities with some disclosures. For example, there are disclosure requirements in Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. Similarly, there are disclosure requirements that banks are subject to in Community Reinvestment Act. In our research, we are going to focus on a specific disclosure requirement as a part of Community Reinvestment Act, which changed in year 2005. Before year 2005, banks are required to disclose geographical details of their lending portfolios. In particular, they need to tell every year how many loans and how much loans they are extending in low, moderate, middle, and high income areas. And I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like. This thing has changed in year 2005, where a new group of banks are created. These are intermediate small banks. They have an asset size of between 250 million and 1 billion. They are exempted from this rule. So if they want, annually, they don't have to release the details of, geographical details of their lending portfolios. It's optional. So in this paper, we are using this setting and see what is the effect of these disclosure requirements in the banking on local economies. And we find that by using some zip code level data, we find that after this disclosure exemption, there is a decrease in the small number of businesses in low or moderate income areas. These are, I would say, poor areas. Similarly, we find that in these areas, there is a decline in small business employment, as well as wages, again, low and moderate income areas. And when we go into a little bit on details where exactly we see these results, we see that most of these low and moderate income areas are areas where there is a high population of racial minorities. Then we ask what exactly is going on here in terms of summary, and we find that by using some performance evaluation report, which these are CRA reports, we hand collect some data, and we find that actually there is a reduced number of lending in these activities by non-disclosing banks. So this is a brief summary of what we find. Let me go a little bit on detail on what's going on in our paper. In terms of the context, CRA Act has been enacted by the Senate in year 1977 against a practice called redlining. Under redlining, cities have these color-coded lending maps where if you see a green, it is a very advantageous area in terms of lending. If you see a red, these are hazardous areas for lending purposes. This is, for example, in year 1940, color-coded redlining map of Chicago. Okay? CRA Act has been enacted against this practice where we don't want to basically avoid some areas to lend. In year 1995, CRA Act has some more structure. And now CRA Act has been applied to banks in two different mechanisms. One, banks are subject to periodic performance reviews in every 2 to 5 years, depending on their size. In these performance reviews, banking regulators visit the banks. They do lending, investment, and service tests, and accordingly, they assign a CRA rating. CRA rating is a big deal if the banks want to expand, they want to merge, or to be acquired. Therefore, it's a big deal to have a good CRA rating. The thing that we focus in our paper is the second channel, which I'm going to call as indirect mechanism, which is the disclosure mechanism. In addition to this periodic banking regulator visits, banks are required to disclose geographical details of their lending portfolios every year. And the idea here is that when the banks disclose these numbers, communities will have access to this data. They are going to go through to see whether the banks are satisfying their community's lending needs, and accordingly, they will basically put some soft pressure on the banks to basically lend, for example, more money in low and moderate income areas. So here is what that CRA disclosure looks like. This is in year 2005 by a bank called Kashmir Valley Bank. If you look at column number 4, we see the data in terms of loans to businesses with a gross annual revenues of less than 1 million. These are small business loans. And we see the number of loans as well as the amount of loans in low income, moderate income, middle income, and high income areas. So basically in year 2005, some banks are accepted from the rule to disclose these numbers to the public. And that is the setting that we use in our paper. Our main prediction is that after this disclosure exemption, some intermediate small banks will change their lending behavior. Why? Because since they are not disclosing these numbers, there will not be enough information in the communities to do this soft pressure, which is the second channel of CRA, to put some soft pressure on the banks to increase their lending to wherever they want. Okay? And we expect our results to be stronger in 3 different settings. First of all, we expect our results, if any we find, to be stronger in zip codes where majority of banks change their disclosure behavior. Just think about the zip code. There are, let's say, 10 intermediate banks. If at least 5 of them change their behavior, we expect our results to be stronger in those settings. Second, we expect our results to be stronger in lower and moderate income areas. These are areas which are specifically targeted by CRAs. We expect some banks to find it very costly to follow the CRA requirements in these areas. Therefore, we expect them to change their lending behavior. And finally, our paper is all about small business loans. Although CRA reports also have information about mortgages, mortgage disclosures are also covered in Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. Okay? So there is not much change in terms of mortgage disclosures. The thing that mainly changes just small business loans. All right, so I am asked not to show some data, but I want to give you some flavor on what exactly is going on. The rule changes in year 2005. We look at basically data 3 years before, 3 years and after, and we find that around these years there are about 1,100 intermediate small banks in the United States. They are basically, if they want, can take advantage of no disclosure rule if they want. Interestingly, we find that out of these 1,100 banks, only 600 of them takes advantage of this rule. 600 of them basically stop disclosing. And 500 of them doesn't change their behavior. They still disclose this annual CRA details of their lending. And again, just to give you a flavor of what we mean by these zip codes, in the data, in every zip code, on average in the United States, there are 210 total establishments. These are total small businesses, out of which 150 of them are small businesses with a number of employees between 1 and 9. They are basically the smallest of the small businesses. Okay? This is basically what our data, that's basically what our setting that we are examining. And here are our findings, which are going into much detail. We find that after this disclosure rule change, there is a 2% decline in small business establishments in low or moderate income areas, let me say poor areas. This translates into about 4 businesses per zip code. And once we look at what type of businesses we are talking about, we find that this effect happens only in one setting, which is smallest of the small business establishments. These are establishments, they have between 1 to 9 employees. As you can imagine, if they basically lose access to their local banking, it's very hard for them to replace this banking with some other bank activities because they have a lot of information asymmetry. Not a lot of basically people know about these banks, so they actually the ones they need community banking. Then we ask, is there anything special about the zip codes that we see our results? And we see that our results are concentrated in 2 types of zip codes. The first zip code these are areas where there is a high population of racial minorities. This is the areas that CRA actually targets to increase lending in these areas. And the second idea about these zip codes is that there is a high number of community workers. If you remember the indirect channel, we will release this data where community organizations will use this data to put some soft pressure. So apparently, in these 2 types of zip codes, high minority population and high number of community workers, there are some intermediate banks, they find it hard or the costly to follow the CRA requirements, and therefore they change their behavior. And then we say, is there any other effects in the local communities? And we look at some labor effects, and we find that in these areas, lower moderate income areas, there is also a similar decline in employment, and there is also similar decline in wages. So there are also two other labor-related consequences. Then we ask, why do we find it? What exactly is going on? What exactly has changed in these intermediate small banks which stop disclosing? The problem, since they stop disclosing this information, we don't know much about what they are doing. But they are still subject to this periodic CRA evaluation. And after the CRA evaluation, there is a report which is close to this annual report. We basically hand collect those data, and we find that actually these non-disclosures reduce their amount of small business lending in lower moderate income areas. So the picture is, after this rule change, there is a group of banks, intermediate small banks, they stop disclosing these geographical details. In the meantime, they change their lending behavior where instead of lending to lower moderate income areas, they lend in other areas, generally middle and high income areas. And because of these reasons, we have some negative consequences in the local communities in the form of small business establishments, wages, and employment. And then we ask, maybe these non-disclosures are doing some other activities in these local communities instead of just changing. Okay, they are changing their lending behavior, but they are maybe compensating with some other activities. So the CRA reports are pretty useful for this setting, and we looked at community development loans. We looked at community investment. We looked at donations that these banks can do to compensate their reduced business lending. And we find no effect of this. It seems like the only thing that's going on, at least according to our results, is that they just cut their lending in these low moderate income areas, and then they channel this to some other areas. So let me conclude. In our paper, we examine a specific setting in CRA about this geographical details of lending portfolios. And we find that after some banks are exempted from this disclosure requirement, they take advantage of this rule, and therefore they change their lending behavior. And because of this reason, we see that there are some negative effects happening in local communities in the form of lower number of small business establishments, especially in the smallest of the small business establishments. Second, local wages go down. And third, local small business employment also go down. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.